Cord automobile created some of the most memorable cars in history, and along with Auburn and Duesenberg, introduced some of the most beautiful and innovative cars of their era. Unfortunately, just as they appeared to hit their peak, the Great Depression soured the story, and investigations into questionable financial dealings ultimately brought all three makes down. But that's not the beginning or the end of the story. This is a far too brief history of Auburn Cord Duesenberg. Welcome back to All Cars, y'all. I'm John, and I've been a fan of Cord since I was very young and first saw a picture of the Cord L29. I had no idea how short-lived it was, or that it was front-wheel drive, and I didn't care. It was just gorgeous. All three marques, Auburn, Duesenberg, and Cord, were tied together by one man who, like many greats in the early automotive years, touched many other famous individuals and designers, and along the way became one of America's great industrialists, ended up selling everything, and went on to make additional fortunes, and even flirted with political office. This is all really the story of E.L. Cord and his vision. Cord was born in Missouri in 1894, and as happens with individuals of that time, not much is known about the specifics of his early life. At about 10 years old, his family moved to LA. He built racing bodies for Ford Model Ts, he raced on dirt tracks in Tacoma, and he worked as a mechanic in a garage. In 1916, he won an 8+ hour race in Arizona and began to put together a business empire of greasing and washing stations. By his early 20s, he was a superstar automotive salesman in Chicago, and it's said that by the mid-1920s, he'd made and lost several fortunes. In 1924, he went to work for Auburn Company, and within a year, he was its president. By 1929, he'd founded Cord Corporation as a holding company for the over 150 companies that he controlled. Before we continue with his life, we must first look back at the companies that started it all, and that's Auburn. Now, Auburn Automotive Company traces its roots back to the Eckhart Carriage Company, founded in 1874 in Auburn, Indiana. The Eckhart sons were interested in automobiles and sold their first car in 1903. They later absorbed two local car makers and combined everything into one plant in 1909. That first car was a single-cylinder, water-cooled, gas engine, open-top car making all of 6 horsepower, and it sold for the staggering sum of $1,450. They quickly upgraded to 2-cylinder, then 4-cylinder, and later 6-cylinder engines by 1912. And in 1912, they developed their first closed-top auto called the Model 40. The company was modestly successful, but during World War I, material shortage cut back production and later forced them to close. So after the war, in 1919, the brothers sold the company to a group of Chicago investors, which included William Wrigley Jr. of, yes, chewing gum fame. The investors revived the business with a new model called the Beauty 6 from a design completed by the Eckharts before the sale. But they couldn't make the company run at a profit, with production ultimately getting down to about 6 cars a day. This is when they approached E.L. Cord to run the company with a reported offer of $30,000 a year. He ended up countering offer with a proposal to buy the company through a leveraged buyout and take it over from them. Without a lot of options, they reluctantly accepted, and by 1925, Cord had control, and by 1926, the company was profitable. Using his salesmanship, he had taken over with over 600 unsold cars, repainted them bright colors, added nickel trim, and went to work. It ultimately worked, and within a few months, all that unsold inventory had been sold. Now, Duesenberg Automobile and Motors Company was started by the brothers Fred and August Duesenberg in 1920 in Indianapolis. Originally building engines in the early 1900s, they designed a vehicle in 1905, and in 1906 formed Mason Motor Car Company with investors including one of the Maytag descendants. By 1912, they had control of the company again, and in 1914, their first vehicle placed 10th in the Indianapolis 500. During World War I, they built aircraft engines, and in 1920, they launched the Model A with a 4.3-liter straight-8 engine with an eye-watering 88 horsepower. This was the largest engine in a commercially available vehicle at the time, and the first to have hydraulic brakes on all four wheels. Their racing success continued, being the first American car to win the 1921 French Grand Prix and winning the Indianapolis 500 in 1922, 1924, 1925, and 1927. Unfortunately, by 1924, the company was in dire financial straits and entered receivership, where Cord purchased it on October 26, 1926, gaining the brand name as well as the brothers' engineering skill, with Fred heading up engineering and experimental work while August headed up a separate independent racing division. Cord immediately set the company to work to produce a car to challenge the best in the world for luxury, power, and size, directly competing with brands such as Hispano-Suiza and Rolls-Royce. This became the Model J in 1928, but more on that in a minute. Now, to oversimplify it, Lycoming was a major engine manufacturer. They started in 1845, according to the company, and it was originally a sewing machine manufacturer known as Demorest, and in 1883 was purchased by two advertising agents in New York who moved the factory to Lycoming County, Pennsylvania, where they produced not just sewing machines, but bicycles, typewriters, and chairs by 1900. By 1907, the sewing machine business had become unprofitable, and the company was sold and refocused on automobile engines. Their first customer in 1910 was Veely, which was founded by a grandson of John Deere. After World War I, they increasingly became Auburn's biggest supplier, and Cord purchased the company in 1927, wrapping it into his Auburn group. Two notable engines produced were an L-head straight 8 of nearly 300 cubic inches that made 125 horsepower, and a double overhead cam straight 8 used in the Duesenberg Model J that produced nearly 265 horsepower, which would have been 6 times the power of a Ford Model A. Later advertisements by Auburn Cord and Duesenberg all proudly bragged that they were powered by Lycoming. At the time, Auburn sold upscale and pricey cars. Consider that in 1926, a Ford Tudor sedan was $580, while an Auburn 76 started at $1,295. In 1928, the company released two memorable models. The first was the boat-tail Auburn Speedster 120, an evolution from earlier models with 120 horsepower, 268 cubic inch engine, and considered one of the most beautiful American cars ever designed. The second is that Duesenberg Model J. Popular with movie stars, royalty, and the exceptionally wealthy, they were often sold as a frame for a custom coach builder to finish, although about half were finished by Duesenberg. They were at the time at least the most expensive cars in the world, with the final car ending up ranging typically between $14,000 and $20,000. This is at a time when the average family made $1,200 a year, and a doctor's average was about $3,000. Originally intending to sell 500 a year, they never came close to that, producing only about 200 before the Great Depression hit. The Model J soldered on until 1937 with many changes, but it quickly became out of date. With other companies moving to fully synchronized gearboxes, Duesenberg stubbornly stayed with an unsynchronized 3-speed, probably because the engine power destroyed synchronized gearboxes, while other manufacturers such as Mercedes were closing in on the horsepower numbers. In 1932, they introduced a supercharged version called the SJ with 320 horsepower and a later short wheelbase, 125 inches versus 142.5, SSJ with close to 400 horsepower. Only two were ever built. In 1929, Cord launched his self-named brand with that L29. This was the first American front-wheel drive car for the public, and the first front-wheel drive car to use CV joints, which are common almost everywhere now. The powertrain up front meant that the car could be lower than contemporary cars, coming in at just over 5 feet in height when competitors were averaging around 6 feet. With a Lycoming 4.9-liter, 125 horsepower Inline 8 and a 3-speed transmission, this heavy car was underpowered but beautiful. Pricing was around $3,000, competitive with makes such as Cadillac, Lincoln, Packard, and others. In spite of the Depression, sales continued to increase, and in 1931 it was the best sales year for Auburn Cord Duesenberg, selling 34,000 cars, making them the 13th largest seller in the US, and they had at the time 100 international dealers in 93 different countries. But the Depression lingered and the market for expensive cars evaporated, with sales halving in one year and halving the next year for the 2 years. Drastic changes were needed, and they were coming with some of the most memorable cars. The company reintroduced a 6-cylinder engine in Auburn's and scaled back production of the 8s and the 12s. In 1935, the Speedster 851 was released with a 4.6-liter flathead 8, making about 150 horsepower and an innovative dual ratio rear axle, effectively giving the car a 6-speed transmission. In 1936, the memorable Cord 810 was introduced and are among the most striking and well-known of the company's products. Once again, it was front-wheel drive, but the first American front-wheel drive car with an independent front suspension and the first production car to feature hidden pop-up headlights, a design feature that disappeared until the Corvette nearly 20 years later. It was powered by that L29's V8, still with 125 horsepower and a semi-automatic 4-speed transmission, and was built on a 125-inch wheelbase. In 1936, prices increased and 2 more models were added on a longer 132-inch wheelbase. Interestingly, it also had hidden door hinges, the hood was rear hinged versus side hinged that was still common, and no running boards, all features that make it look clean but don't really shout at you. When it debuted at the New York Auto Show in November 1935, it was a hit, and the company took orders promising a Christmas delivery. But the semi-automatic transmission was troublesome, and production didn't start until February of the next year, with the first cars not being available until April. Unfortunately, the car had reliability issues, including slipping out of gear and vapor lock, and by 1936 they were renumbering unsold inventory to sell as 1937 models, including calling them the 812. Expected production of 1,000 a month ended up being only 2,972 cars ever sold. It's important here to notice a couple of things. First, Cord has stretched his finances very thin. His first wife died in 1930, and he increasingly turned control of his company to others. He ended up actually leaving the country for England in about 1934, supposedly because of kidnapping threats, and returned in 1936. Second, in that a major misstep, Cord had attempted to extend his empire and help an acquaintance with the takeover of Checker Motors in 1932-1933. You can see more about that on my Checker video. But this unfortunately got the interest of the Security and Exchange Commission for questionable stock manipulation when the share price for Checker jumped from $7 to $69 in under 6 months. When he returned to the U.S., Cord was under an SEC investigation, and to avoid prosecution and further investigation, he sold Cord Corporation to financier Dallas Winslow in 1938, including the Auburn Administration Building that is now the Auburn Cord Duesenberg Museum. The story gets a little muddled here. Some sources say that Cord sold his stake in the holding company directly to Avco, AVCO, an aviation company controlling multiple companies, including the predecessor of American Airlines, while others reference Winslow's ownership and then eventually being transferred over to Avco. Lycoming stopped production of automobile engines to focus on airplane manufacturing, but another source says that Cord reorganized the aviation holding in 1939 to Avco. In 1940, Universal Airlines was broken out, and you know that today as American Airlines. Regardless, Cord walked away with an estimated $2 million, and he'd lost control of his companies, and he was just 43 years old. In 1935, in an effort to stave off bankruptcy, Cord had combined Auburn Automobile and central manufacturing that made their bodies to produce a line of kitchen cabinets, trying to generate some cash flow. After Cord sold his interest, it went bankrupt and formed the Auburn Central Manufacturing Corporation. During World War II, they produced over 150,000 Jeep bodies, as well as trailers and aircraft components. And after the war, they went back into kitchen cabinets, sinks, and appliances, and ended up becoming a division of Avco in 1947. Lycoming switched to aircraft engines and continued to produce them as a portion of Honeywell Aerospace even to today. Aircraft manufacturer Stinson was the largest producer of commercial cabin planes and was absorbed by Avco, then Vultee, until Piper acquired them in 1948. Vultee itself was founded in 1932, and Cord quickly bought up all of the company's stock, and after Cord's liquidation, it became a division of Avco and itself acquired Lycoming and Stinson. In 1939, it was an independent company. By 1943, it had merged with Consolidated Aircraft Corporation to form Convair. During the war, they produced trainers, fighters, and dive bombers, and in 1953, they were purchased by General Dynamics. After selling his ownership in ACD, Cord relocated to his mansion in Beverly Hills and made more millions by buying up some of the most desirable real estate available. He owned several radio and TV stations in California and Nevada, and the radio station in LA, KFAC, stands for Auburn Cord. He purchased a 2,200-acre ranch, although some sources say it was 3,400, the Circle L near Dyer, Nevada, and raised cattle and acquired more holdings in uranium mines and other minerals. During the 1940s, he was called upon to fill in for a Nevada state legislator who had died, dipping his toes into politics, and by 1958 he was asked to run for the governorship of Nevada, but he declined and never gave a reason. Cord eventually died in 1974 at the age of 79. It's insane to me just how fast this bright flame burned and then burned out. Consider that from being given control of Auburn in 1925 to building an empire of 150-ish companies to being compelled to sell it all off was a total of about 12 years. In that time, he purchased or controlled their engine manufacturer, their body manufacturer, a luxury car brand to compete with Rolls, established Cord as advanced styling and engineering. He owned New York Shipbuilding, Checker Cabs, Stinson Aircraft, Vultee, and many others, including, again, that forerunner of what is today American Airways. There's so many interesting facts around these companies, and just one more for you in closing. That Cord 810 was the last front-wheel drive car for nearly 30 years until Oldsmobile introduced the Tornado in 1966. Its powertrain layout of the engine longitudinally with the transmission in front has never ever been used again on an American vehicle. Thanks for watching. If you appreciate these histories, please show your love. A special thanks to my Patreon supporters, and if you'd like to support histories like this, as well as my news opinions pieces, please consider becoming a Patreon. And thanks for being here.